Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I was born in Nairobi. I grew up in Pangani till the age of 5 when my parents moved to London. So I grew up in London in the 70s and 80s. I had generally very happy memories of Nairobi and Kenya, and generally happy in North London, except for one thing, which was there was a lot of racism in Britain at that time, because lots and lots of Africans, Afro-Caribbeans, Indian and Pakistanis had come to Britain recently, and a lot of white British people didn't like this, and there's open racism on a daily basis at school, on the roads, on the TV stations, racist programs, everywhere. It was rife everywhere, and that became a grievance for me from childhood, because the experience of racism really leaves deep trauma. So I'm talking about being told to go back to where you come from, you don't belong here, even though English was now my first language, and by the grace of God I was top of the school in all my subjects. I went to the top schools, universities. I can remember my family being verbally abused outside London Central Mosque and having alcohol thrown over us, mum and dad and children. I can remember racist boys throwing stones at us outside the Birmingham Central Mosque. I can remember my mum being racially abused by a man in uniform at the train station, an old white man, because she bought the wrong ticket by mistake. And I was like crying as a 7-year-old boy that my mum was being humiliated in public, and the whole crowd gathered to listen to this man abuse my mum, and her English wasn't strong enough for her to reply. And also we were from an Indian Pakistani background. We used to go to Pakistan every year for the summer holidays, or every 2 years, via Saudi Arabia. We used to go to Mecca and Medina, the holiest places of Islam. So we had a very strong Islamic upbringing. My parents and grandparents and great-grandparents, the men and the women, they're all Islamic scholars, by the way. They're all Quran teachers. So we had a very devout lifestyle in Britain, which was very different to the rest of society. Although we appreciated Britain was a much more Christian country at the time. It's post-Christian now, a generation later. Anyway, growing up in that situation, we identified more with the Muslim world. And so I can remember, even I was in primary school, 1979, you had the so-called Islamic Revolution in Iran, you had the siege of Mecca, where Al-Qaeda type extremists took over the Grand Mosque in Mecca itself and held it for 2 weeks. 1,000 people died in that incident before the Saudi government got it back under control. And at the end of that year, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. Now, throughout the 80s, you had this 10-year-long jihad in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union. You had the Iran-Iraq war, you had Israel, Lebanon, Palestine, PLO, the rise of Hezbollah and Hamas. And I was following all of this, glued to the newspapers and to the TV. And at this time, I also joined a radical and also extremist Muslim group in Britain. And when I say radical and extremist, I believe being radical is positive, being radical is good, meaning you bring new ideas and you're fearless. But extremist is bad. That's condemned in the Quran and the Sunnah, the teaching of the Prophet, that we shouldn't be extreme. But also, for the first time in my life, aged around 12 or 13, for the first time in my life I felt safe, because I was with my band of brothers. We used to study the Quran once a week, but we also had martial arts classes once a week. And so the fear that I grew up with on a daily basis of racist attack, which we experienced, verbal abuse but also physical attacks, for the first time disappeared. And with that group, we were like a Muslim power group, a bit like the Black Power movements of the US, to defend and promote Muslim identity.
Like the Black Panthers?
Yeah, we're a bit like that, yeah. We loved Malcolm X, of course. We preferred Malcolm X's approach to Martin Luther King's, for example. And we decided to go all the way because we've been following the jihad in Afghanistan, where, tens of thousands of fighters from all over the world came in the name of jihad against the Soviet Union. Our group actually sent fighters a few dozens of fighters who traveled all the way from Britain to Afghanistan to take part in the jihad at the end of the 80s and the early 90s. And I myself was one of those people. 1990 to 91, I was in Afghanistan. At this time, I was an undergraduate student at Cambridge University studying physics and mathematics, where our teachers included Professor Stephen Hawking, the greatest mathematician since Einstein. But during my holidays, I actually took part, and we spent a week at the Arab training camp for the Mujahideen, and 24 hours at the front line. And that's an experience I will never forget as a 19-year-old, who was basically a scholar. I was a bookworm, really, but to fire Kalashnikovs, M16 machine guns, huge artillery guns at the front line is an experience of adventure, camaraderie with the Mujahideen, taking part in the war, nearly dying because the shell nearly landed on our heads, just missed us. That taught me that, confirmed to me our religious teaching that life and death are in the hands of God. Otherwise I wouldn't be here talking to you. And we also sent dozens of fighters to Bosnia, to Kashmir, to Chechnya, even to Burma for the Rohingya cause back in the 90s. And all of those, I believe, were legitimate causes. That was all legitimate jihad, because the Afghan jihad was legitimate. The fighters who joined the Bosnian Mujahideen were officially made part of the Bosnian army as a foreign legion. So that was all legitimate military jihad. The turning point in this matter came with 9/11, you see, because one wing of this vast jihad movement in Afghanistan, only one wing of it became Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda did not represent the entire jihad movement, which lasted for 13 years at many different groups. But one extreme wing of Al-Qaeda first attacked Nairobi, actually, of course, in 1998, and Dar es Salaam. And then their biggest attack was 9/11. And that left us stunned as to what's going on, because we had supported these kind of Mujahideen people. In fact, we were of them, you know. But we never supported targeting innocent people. Myself and my colleagues traveled thousands of miles to Afghanistan, Bosnia, Kashmir, Chechnya, Burma. Some even went to Palestine to try to take part in the conflict there, although they weren't able to. But the thought of attacking Western countries never even crossed our mind. And we saw, you see, the attacks were mainly in New York and Washington, 9/11. New York and London have a lot of similarities and contrasts. You know, we only have an ocean between us. And I saw the grief of the British people, especially Londoners, as to on the attack of 9/11. I now work at the Tony Blair Institute. My current boss, the Tony Blair, was Prime Minister at the time when 9/11 happened. And this forced a whole lot of soul searching. Because Tony Blair I was a huge fan of his then, I'm still a huge fan of his now. But after that, of course, he allied with George Bush to invade Afghanistan and Iraq. We had to do a lot of soul searching as to what's going on. How can the former Mujahideen now start killing innocent people in their thousands? And we realized, myself and my elders who I went to Afghanistan with, we all independently came to the same conclusion, that we had to distinguish between jihad and terrorism. You have legitimate jihad with legitimate armed forces or legitimate foreign legions against an army. You only fight armies. So for example, in the 90s I lost two of my friends. One was killed in Bosnia by Serb forces, one was killed in Kashmir by Indian forces. But they were fighting armies, they never attacked civilians. And so by the time our 9/11 happened, which was the London bombing of 2005, I was already preaching at the mosque against terrorism. And I'd already received my first death threats from the supporters of the terrorists who said that I deserved to be killed because I was going against the jihad. But I wasn't going against true jihad. I was going against the terrorism because I memorized the Quran as well, like any imam as a child. And I began leading prayers aged 11, exactly 40 years ago. But London was a big wake-up call for me, because I never thought that people would attack my own beloved hometown city of London, where I went to school, went to the top schools, had a great experience, where my beloved football team, Arsenal, that's the home of Arsenal Football Club, of which I'm a proud supporter, you don't attack your own tide. I mean, it's just unthinkable. And but unfortunately, this is what Al-Qaeda decided to do, was to attack Western countries. And as we know, ISIS grew out of Al-Qaeda. And I often thank God that I wasn't born, even 5 or 10 years later, because I can understand young people, the excitement and adventure of taking part in a military conflict, the camaraderie, the feeling that you're defending your brothers and sisters worldwide. It's a cause which is very powerful. And of course, with Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Al-Shabaab, and these guys with their slick propaganda videos, where they take advantage of people with very little knowledge to say this is jihad, to attack Garissa University Christians, where we went yesterday to the memorial, that's jihad, or to attack Nairobi Westgate or Dusit Hotel, this is jihad. There are people who don't know their religion and they're taken in by this. Where by the grace of God I knew my Quran, and the soul searching helped me by realizing that in the Quran, jihad was originally non-violent. In the Quran it says, withhold your hands, just like the Bible, the New Testament teaching of turn the other cheek. That's in the Quran. But in the Quran it's kuffu aydiyakum, withhold your hands. Jihad was only legislated in self-defense. All of the views about military jihad were in self-defense, except for one verse which is disputed as to whether or not it allows for offensive jihad as well as defensive jihad. All right, but this is where we need deep Islamic scholarship and experience to distinguish between the two. So unfortunately, the threat of terrorism, wherever you have grievances and discrimination, and grievances can be anything: poverty, unemployment, Islamophobia. It can be seeing innocent people, especially Muslims, innocent Muslims killed around the world by, for example, Western so-called Christian forces. All of these can be grievances which extremists will use to recruit people and to fill them up with ideas of martyrdom and holy war, sacred war, just war, which are found in Christianity and Islam, and every major world religion has a militant tradition, to fight for the sake of God and for the sake of truth. But that needs to be confined. So unfortunately, with the 25 years of Al-Qaeda and ISIS terrorism and violence, which began in Nairobi really, right here from 1998, we come up to a quarter of a century of that kind of recruitment, and it's gone to new levels with the internet, etc. That's why there's still such a threat of terror. And unless we defeat the ideology, I've been working in this field for a long time, and now Western governments, my own boss, Sir Tony Blair, and others, they all agree, Western leaders, that we cannot defeat this problem through military means alone. Military action is part of the solution, but it must be done carefully in a targeted way to not make the problem worse and cause more grievances for recruitment for the terrorists. But ultimately, the only way to defeat this problem is to defeat the bad ideas and the ignorant, evil, genocidal views of the terrorists with better ideas, which are grounded deeply in the Quran, in the scriptures, because the Quran's basic fundamental message is of mercy. Every verse of the Quran begins with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, all merciful, most merciful. God has 99 names in the Quran. The first two are all merciful, most merciful. The Prophet is called as nothing but a mercy to the world. Mercy is the basic principle of the Quran, just as love is the basic principle of the Bible for Christians. But the two are intertwined, love and mercy. So we have to effectively demolish the arguments of the terrorists who talk about how Muslims must live separately to everybody else under their own Islamic state or caliphate, how the rest of the world is a land of war. So Al-Shabaab and other terrorists believe that only the land under their control is the land of Islam. The rest of the world, including Saudi Arabia, including Pakistan, including Kenya, all of it is a land of war, and they can do whatever they like, for example, and do that through their mistorted view of jihad. We have to defeat those completely ignorant, deluded, but very dangerous ideas. That's how we deal with this terrorist threat.